Who's making you laugh so much? She glanced up at me for just a second, her expression calm, almost bored. It's Ashley. We're planning brunch this weekend. Ashley. She hadn't mentioned Ashley in a while, but it wasn't exactly suspicious. Still, something about the way she said it, the quickness of her response, it made my gut tighten. Felt like there was more hidden behind her words. But I didn't press. It was just a small feeling, nothing concrete. Who suspects their wife over something so trivial? The next morning, Samantha was even sweeter than usual. She made breakfast, kissed me before she left to run errands. But there was something off in the way she moved, like she was putting on a show, too eager to leave. The way she clung to her phone made my suspicions grow, but I kept telling myself I was imagining it. When she returned late that evening, she barely looked at me before disappearing into her phone again. That's when I knew, deep down, something was seriously wrong. The following week, I couldn't ignore the changes anymore. She was distant, her attention always somewhere else, always on that phone. I could feel her slipping away, but without any hard proof, I kept doubting myself. Maybe it was stress from work. Maybe I was just paranoid. But when you've been married as long as we have, you can tell when the little things start adding up to something bigger. Part 2. The discovery. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything started to unravel. Samantha was at work, and I was at home trying to shake off this growing sense of unease. I'd been replaying every small change in her behavior in my head, but it wasn't until that afternoon that I found the smoking gun, the moment that cracked everything wide open. I had gone to the garage to grab a tool, when I noticed something gleaming in the console of her car. Her phone. She must have forgotten to take it with her. It sat there, unlocked, as if inviting me to see what was really going on. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew that once I did, there would be no turning back. But something deeper, something rawer, took over. I reached for it, hands trembling, and I unlocked the screen. The messages were right there, waiting for me. I saw Ashley's name at the top of her recent messages, just like she'd told me. But when I opened the thread, I froze. The name on the other side of those messages wasn't Ashley. It was Brad. My stomach dropped. Who the hell was Brad? I didn't know any Brad, and Samantha had never mentioned him before. My fingers moved on autopilot as I scrolled through their conversation. First, it looked innocent enough, but then the text started to shift. The tone was too familiar, too intimate. My eyes scanned the words quickly, my heart racing as I read more. "I can't wait to see you again," one of his messages said. "Last night was amazing." Her reply came soon after. "I miss your touch already." Counting the days. My blood went cold. There was no mistaking what this meant. This wasn't just a friendship, wasn't just innocent messages exchanged in passing. This was betrayal, plain and simple. I kept scrolling, even though every word felt like a punch in the gut. The text got worse, more explicit, and I could feel the rage building up inside me. I had been a fool. For months, I had been ignoring the signs, telling myself that everything was fine. And all the while, she'd been sneaking around with this guy, living a double life right under my nose. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, my hands shaking. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in around me. This was real. This was happening. The woman I had trusted with my life, with everything, was lying to me, betraying me in the worst possible way. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. Should I confront her right now? Wait until she got home? I felt like I was going to explode from the anger and hurt swirling inside me. For a few minutes, I just sat there in the garage, staring at the dashboard, trying to calm myself down. But there was no calming down from something like this. There was no going back to before. This was the moment when everything in my life changed. The moment when my marriage, my trust, everything I thought was solid, crumbled into pieces. Samantha had been living a lie, and now I had to figure out what to do next. That night, I couldn't wait any longer. The rage and disbelief boiled inside me, and by the time Samantha walked through the door, I was ready. She came in, casual as ever, smiling like she hadn't just shattered my entire world. Her purse hung loosely from her shoulder, and she barely glanced at me as she entered the kitchen. It was like nothing had changed for her. But for me, everything had. I stood there, arms crossed, trying to control my breathing. The words were stuck in my throat, but I knew I had to say something before I exploded. She finally noticed my silence, turned, and looked at me, her smile faltering when she saw my face. "What's up?" she asked, her voice just a little too light, a little too fake. I took a deep breath, every muscle in my body tense. "Who's Brad?" The color drained from her face so fast, it was almost like watching a mask fall off. For a split second, she looked panicked, like a deer caught in headlights. But then, as quickly as that fear came, it was gone, replaced by a cool, practiced calm. She rolled her eyes and tossed her purse on the counter. "You went through my phone?" she said, her tone sharp, accusatory, like she was the one who had been wronged. I laughed bitterly, unable to believe she was really going to play it this way. "Don't try to turn this around on me, Samantha. I saw the messages. I know what's been going on. Who the hell is Brad?" She sighed, folding her arms across her chest as if she was already tired of the conversation. "He's just a friend, Mark. Don't be so dramatic. Just a friend." I spat, my voice rising. "You don't send messages like that to a friend. You don't miss a friend's touch, Samantha. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" She pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me, sizing me up, as if deciding how much she could get away with. "A few months," she said, her voice clipped, like it wasn't a big deal. "A few months," I shouted, unable to control the fury that erupted inside me. "Are you kidding me? You've been sneaking around behind my back for months, and you act like it's nothing?" Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look ashamed. "I didn't plan for this to happen, Mark. It just did." I shook my head, disbelief coursing through me. "Things like this don't just happen, Samantha. You made a choice. You chose to lie, to cheat. And now you're standing here acting like it's no big deal." She sighed again, rolling her eyes. "I'm not going to apologize for how I feel. I needed something, Mark. Something I wasn't getting from you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back a step, staring at her in shock. "So this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your affair?" She shrugged, her expression completely indifferent. "You've been distant. You're always working late, always stressed, and we haven't really been close for a long time. I needed to feel wanted, needed. Brad. He gave me that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mind was spinning, trying to process the sheer audacity of what she was saying. She was turning it around, making me the villain, as if her betrayal was somehow justified because I'd been busy, because I hadn't been perfect. "You could have talked to me," I said, my voice shaking with anger and pain. "You could have told me how you were feeling, but instead you chose to cheat. You chose to lie." She didn't even blink. "And what good would that have done? You don't listen. You're too wrapped up in your own world to even notice me half the time." I felt like I was being gaslit, like everything I knew about our marriage was being rewritten right in front of me. Was she really trying to say this was all on me? That she was the victim here? "This isn't about me, Samantha," I snapped, my voice cold. "This is about you and your choices. You chose to destroy what we had." She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a slight, bitter smile. "Maybe it was already broken. Maybe we've been broken for a long time." The words hung in the air like a poison, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what she was saying. Was she right? Had we been broken for longer than I realized? I didn't know what to believe anymore, but it didn't change the fact that she had betrayed me, that she had lied, for months, while I had no idea what was going on. I turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore. My chest felt tight, like I could barely breathe. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Pain, deep and sharp, cutting through me in a way I hadn't expected. "I need some space," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't argue. She didn't even try to stop me. I walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with everything, was gone. And in her place was someone I didn't even recognize. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. I drove aimlessly that night, my mind racing as fast as the tires rolling over the dark, empty streets. I couldn't go home, not yet. The house had become a place I didn't recognize anymore, filled with lies and betrayal. I needed to think, needed to breathe. But no matter how far I drove, the weight of what I just discovered sat heavy on my chest, suffocating me. Samantha's words echoed in my mind on a loop, each one twisting the knife a little deeper. Maybe we've been broken for a long time. Was she right? Had our marriage been on life support for months, maybe even years, and I was just too blind to see it? Or was this just another one of her manipulations, another way to shift the blame away from what she'd done? I found myself parked at a 24-hour diner. The neon lights buzzed above, flickering in and out of focus as I sat there in the car, staring blankly at the empty parking lot. The cold truth was, I didn't know what was real anymore. My whole world had just flipped upside down, and I didn't know how to make sense of it. I thought back to when things were good, back to when Samantha and I first got together. We were inseparable, so full of life and passion. It was the kind of love that felt unbreakable. But somewhere along the way something changed. The late nights at work, the unspoken tension between us, the distance that grew larger each day. I just never thought it would lead here. I couldn't stop thinking about Brad. This man I didn't even know, but who somehow knew more about my wife than I did. How long had he been part of her life? How long had she been texting him, meeting him behind my back? While I was sitting at home thinking everything was fine, the betrayal hit me again like a punch to the gut. I gripped the steering wheel tight, trying to keep the rage from boiling over. At some point, I realized I couldn't sit there forever. I couldn't keep running from the reality that was now my life. So I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over her contact name. I didn't want to call her, didn't want to hear her voice, but I knew I had to go back at some point. The drive home felt like an eternity, every second filled with dread. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed in front of me, dark and silent. My hands felt heavy as I turned the key in the lock, pushing open the door to a house that no longer felt like my own. Samantha was sitting on the couch, still awake, her arms folded across her chest. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she didn't look much of anything, just calm, like she had been expecting this. "You're back," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the warmth it once had. It was as if we were just two strangers sharing the same space. I walked past her, heading straight for the kitchen. I needed something, anything, to dull the sharp edges of what I was feeling. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and twisted the cap off, leaning against the counter as I stared at her from across the room. "Why, Samantha?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. "Why did you do it?" She sighed, her eyes downcast for the first time. "I told you, Mark. I needed something. Something I wasn't getting from you." "That's bullshit," I snapped, slamming the beer bottle down onto the counter so hard I thought it might break. "You could have talked to me. You could have told me what you needed instead of sneaking around behind my back." "I tried," she said, her voice rising in frustration. "You never listened. You were too busy with work, with everything else but me." "That's not an excuse," I shot back, my chest tightening with anger. "Nothing justifies what you did. You made a choice to cheat, Samantha. You betrayed me." She met my eyes then, her gaze colder than I'd ever seen. "I don't regret it." Those words hit me harder than anything she'd said before. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. She didn't regret it? How could she be so heartless, so cold? The woman I had married, the woman I had loved for years, was standing in front of me like a stranger. "Do you even love me anymore?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of the question. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at me, as if searching for the right words, or maybe the courage to say them. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice soft but laced with a cruel honesty. I don't know if I've loved you for a long time. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. That was it, the final blow. It was like every part of me crumbled in that moment, the last pieces of hope I had been clinging to falling apart. She didn't love me. Maybe she hadn't loved me for a while, and I had been too blind, too caught up in trying to hold everything together, to see it. I pushed away from the counter, unable to stand in that room with her any longer. I stormed upstairs, my mind spinning, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. I didn't know what was next. All I knew was that my marriage was over, whether I wanted to admit it or not. The next morning was eerily quiet. I woke up with a heavy weight in my chest, the reality of the night before pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Samantha was already awake, moving around the kitchen when I came downstairs. There was no point in avoiding the inevitable. We had reached the breaking point and we both knew it. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the silence between us thick and uncomfortable. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, I broke the silence. What do we do now? She didn't look up from her coffee as she answered, her voice flat. I think we both know this isn't working. It was the truth I hadn't wanted to face, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak right away. Divorce was the last thing I ever thought we'd talk about, but after everything that had happened, there didn't seem to be another option. Maybe we should take some time apart, she continued, her eyes finally meeting mine. Figure out what we really want. I knew she was right. The anger and betrayal were still there, but underneath it all, there was a sadness, a deep, aching sadness that this was how it had to end. I had loved her, truly, but the woman sitting in front of me wasn't the same person I'd fallen in love with. Maybe we both had changed too much to ever go back. I'll move out, I said quietly, the words feeling heavy in my throat. Samantha nodded, not arguing, not protesting. There was no fight left in either of us. We were done. A few days later, I stood in the middle of what was once our shared home, surrounded by boxes that now seemed to carry the weight of my entire life. My clothes, my books, little pieces of my past all stuffed into cardboard, ready to be transported into the unknown. The house was eerily quiet, and every step I took seemed to echo in the empty rooms. It felt like the end of something far more profound than just a chapter. This was the end of us, of the life I thought I knew. Samantha wasn't there, and I was grateful for that. The last thing I needed was another encounter with her cold detachment, her cruel indifference. Seeing her again would have only reopened wounds that were still too raw, too fresh to bear. I couldn't deal with more of her excuses, more of her justifications for the mess she had created. We'd agreed to give each other space, and I was going to take it. I had found a small apartment on the other side of town. Nothing fancy, just a temporary place to figure out my next steps. Moving out wasn't just about leaving a physical space. It was about emotionally and mentally pulling away from the wreckage of our marriage. The longer I stayed in that house, the more I felt the walls closing in on me, suffocating me with memories of what was, and what would never be again. I tossed the last box into the back of my car and slammed the trunk shut. Before getting in the driver's seat, I paused and looked back at the house. Our house, the place where we once dreamed of a future, where we laughed, argued, made plans. The place where I thought we were building something solid. But standing there now, it just felt like a hollow shell. The memories that had once filled it seemed distant, blurry, as if they belonged to someone else's life. As I drove away, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had fallen apart. In the span of a few weeks, my entire world had crumbled. I had gone from believing in the safety of my marriage to discovering that the person I trusted most had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And yet, I couldn't shake this strange sense of numbness that had settled over me, like my emotions were too exhausted to feel anything more. When I pulled into the parking lot of my new apartment, reality started to sink in. This was it, my new beginning, but it didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt more like the aftermath of a storm, where everything is left in pieces, and you're not sure where to begin putting it all back together. The apartment was small, bare, and cold. The walls were a bland off-white, and the air inside felt stale, like it had been waiting for someone to give it life again. I dragged the boxes in one by one, setting them down in the living room without even bothering to unpack. It didn't feel like home. It didn't feel like anything, really. Just a space. A temporary shelter while I figured out how to move forward. I sank onto the couch, which was one of the few pieces of furniture I had brought with me from the house. It was a strange feeling, sitting there in the silence with no one around. No Samantha's footsteps, no familiar hum of the refrigerator, no shared meals, no shared anything. Just me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe a friend to call, someone to talk to. But every name I passed felt too distant, too disconnected from what I was going through. I hadn't told many people about the affair yet. I wasn't ready to face the looks of pity, the questions, the "I'm so sorry" responses that would only make me feel worse. My finger hovered over Samantha's name for a moment. Should I text her? Call her? But what would I say? We'd said everything that needed to be said, hadn't we? Her last words still echoed in my mind. I don't regret it. She didn't regret it, and that was the part that still made my chest tighten every time I thought about it. There was no apology, no remorse. Just cold, heartless acceptance of what she'd done. She was already moving on. I threw the phone onto the coffee table, unable to bear the thought of reaching out to her. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. The silence in the apartment pressed in on me, and I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. I needed to get out, clear my head, escape from the thoughts that were circling around like vultures. I grabbed my jacket and keys and headed out the door, not sure where I was going but knowing I couldn't stay still. The city streets were busy, full of life. People walking, laughing, going about their days as if nothing had changed in their world. And yet, for me, everything had. It was strange, seeing the world keep moving while I felt like mine had stopped. I ended up at a small bar a few blocks from the apartment. The kind of place where no one knew you and no one cared. I found a seat at the bar and ordered a drink, hoping the alcohol would numb the edges of my pain, even if just for a little while. As I sat there, staring into the amber liquid, I thought about what came next. The divorce was inevitable. There was no going back now. But the thought of it, the finality of it, felt like a weight pressing down on me. I wasn't just losing a marriage. I was losing the future I had imagined, the dreams we had built together, the life I thought I was living. But in the midst of all the loss, I realized something else. I was also gaining something, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. I was gaining freedom. Freedom from the lies, from the betrayal, from the toxic relationship that had been poisoning me without my even knowing it. And maybe, just maybe, that freedom would eventually lead to something better. Something real. For now, though, I just sat there, drinking in the quiet, trying to make sense of the chaos that had become my life. Days passed, blending into weeks, and the initial shock of the separation began to wear off, leaving behind a numbness that I couldn't shake. My new apartment felt more like a waiting room than a home. The walls, bare and impersonal, mirrored my internal emptiness. I had unpacked only what was necessary. Some clothes, a few dishes, the couch, and left the rest of my belongings untouched in boxes, as if unpacking them would somehow make this new reality more permanent. Every morning I'd wake up, lie in bed for a few minutes, and let the weight of the situation wash over me all over again. There was a small window in my bedroom that let in just enough light to remind me that the world was still turning, even if my own life felt frozen in place. I would eventually force myself out of bed, throw on clothes, and head to work. Work was the only thing that made sense anymore. It was predictable, structured, and most importantly, it was an escape. But no matter how much time I spent at the office, no matter how many projects I buried myself in, there was no outrunning the reality of my situation. Every night I came back to the same cold, empty apartment. I'd walk through the door and be greeted by silence, a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing me. Friends had started to reach out more, sensing that something was wrong. Even though I hadn't shared much, they knew about the separation, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about the affair. Not yet. I didn't want to be that guy, the one whose wife cheated on him, the one everyone whispered about behind his back. offering pitying looks when they thought I wasn't watching. I wasn't ready for that, so I dodged invitations and kept my conversations brief, telling people I was just busy with work. One night, about a month after I had moved out, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of Samantha and me from when we were still happy, or at least when I thought we were. Vacation photos, selfies from lazy Sundays at home, the two of us smiling like we had the world figured out. I couldn't help but wonder when it all started to go wrong. When did we stop being those people? I knew that dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything, but I couldn't help it. The what-ifs plagued me. What if I had noticed the signs earlier? What if I had worked less, paid more attention, been more present? Would any of it have made a difference? Or was this where we were always headed? That's the thing about betrayal. It forces you to question everything. Every decision, every moment, every feeling becomes suspect. You start to doubt your own judgment, wondering how you could have been so blind, so trusting. And in the quiet moments, when there's nothing to distract you, those doubts become deafening. It was on one of those nights, sitting alone in the apartment, that I decided to see a therapist. I'd been resisting the idea for weeks, telling myself that I didn't need help, that I could handle it on my own. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I was lost, and I needed someone to help me find my way back. The first therapy session was awkward. I didn't know where to start. How do you sum up the collapse of your marriage in 1 hour? But the therapist, a calm woman in her mid-40s named Sarah, was patient, guiding me through the mess of emotions I'd been bottling up since the discovery of the affair. It's normal to feel lost after something like this, she told me. Betrayal shakes the foundation of everything you thought you knew. I nodded, but her words didn't make the pain any less real. She asked me about Samantha, about the good times and the bad, and slowly, I began to unravel the tangled web of my feelings. The anger, the hurt, the guilt, it all came pouring out. "What do you feel guilty about?" she asked at one point, tilting her head slightly. I stared at the floor, the weight of the question hanging in the air. I hadn't expected to feel guilty. I was the one who had been cheated on, after all. But as I thought about it, the guilt became more tangible. "I feel like I failed," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't see the signs. I was too focused on work, too distracted. Maybe if I had been more present, she wouldn't have felt the need to go looking for something else. Sarah nodded, but didn't let me off the hook that easily. "You're blaming yourself for her choices. But Samantha's actions were hers alone. Even if your marriage wasn't perfect, she had other options. She could have communicated, sought help, made different decisions. Cheating was her choice, not your failure." The logic made sense, but the emotional weight of it was harder to shake. We continued to dig deeper in the weeks that followed, peeling back layers of pain and confusion that I hadn't even realized were there. Therapy wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't supposed to be. But it gave me the tools to start understanding my own feelings, to separate Samantha's actions from my self-worth. Eventually, the apartment began to feel less like a prison and more like a space I could rebuild in. I unpacked the boxes, one by one, turning the sterile environment into something that resembled a home. It was small steps, putting up pictures, buying new furniture, even cooking a few meals instead of eating takeout every night. But each step felt like progress, like I was slowly reclaiming my life. I hadn't spoken to Samantha since the day we decided to separate. She hadn't reached out, and I hadn't either. There was nothing left to say. The divorce papers had been filed, and soon we would be officially done. Felt strange, the finality of it. Part of me had expected some big emotional conclusion, a dramatic goodbye, something. But the truth was, our marriage had ended long before the papers were signed. We had just been too scared to admit it. As I sat in my new apartment one night, the weight of the past months lifting ever so slightly, I realized something. For the first time since the discovery of the affair, I felt something other than anger, other than pain. I felt relief, not because I had wanted things to end this way, but because I was finally free from the lies, the betrayal, the endless cycle of doubt. I was free to move on, to rebuild, to find out who I was without her. It wasn't going to be easy. Healing never is. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance. The day the divorce papers came through, I expected to feel something more significant. A wave of relief or maybe a fresh wave of sadness. Instead, I felt nothing. Not the numbness I'd been drowning in for the past few months, but a different kind of nothingness. It was like the final piece of a long, exhausting puzzle had finally clicked into place, and now the picture was clear. I was officially divorced. That chapter of my life was closed. Samantha had signed the papers without any drama. In fact, the whole process was cleaner than I'd expected. No fighting, no arguments over who gets what. I think we both just wanted it to be over. There was nothing left between us to fight for. Once the betrayal was out in the open, it was like we both realized we had already checked out of the marriage long before. That evening, I sat on the balcony of my apartment with a beer in hand, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the rooftops, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to think about the future. I wasn't ready to start dating again. Hell, I wasn't even sure when or if I ever would be. But the idea that there was a future at all, one that didn't include Samantha or the weight of our failed marriage, felt liberating. My phone buzzed beside me, breaking the quiet moment. I picked it up, expecting another work email or a message from one of the friends I'd been avoiding. But instead, it was a message from Samantha. For a second, I just stared at the screen, unsure if I should open it. It was strange seeing her name pop up after so much silence. I thought about deleting it, about moving on without looking back, but curiosity, or maybe some leftover piece of our history, made me swipe it open. I heard the papers went through. I hope you're okay. That was it. Simple. Almost too simple. Like she was trying to check a box, make sure she did her part. There was no apology, no attempt to reconnect, no real emotion behind the words. Just a clinical acknowledgement that our marriage was officially over. I could hear her voice in those words. Detached, calculated, still the same woman who had shattered my trust and walked away as if it meant nothing. I typed out a response, then deleted it, then typed another one, and deleted that too. What could I say that hadn't already been said? There was no point in dragging out something that had already been beaten to death. So I put my phone down, deciding that silence was the best answer I could give. Sitting there, I thought about how strange it was, how someone who was once your whole world could become a stranger so quickly. There was a time when I couldn't imagine my life without Samantha in it, when every decision I made was tied to our future together. And now, here I was, looking out over a city full of possibilities, and she was just a part of my past. A painful one, but a part that no longer had a hold over me. Over the next few weeks, I started to settle into my new normal. I threw myself back into work, but not in the same way I had before. I wasn't using it to escape anymore. Instead, I found comfort in the routine, in the structure it gave my day. I went to therapy religiously, peeling back more layers of what had happened, not just in the affair, but in myself. I had to admit that I had changed too, that the man I was when I met Samantha wasn't the same man sitting in that therapist's office now. And that was okay. I also started to let friends back in. Slowly, at first. I wasn't ready for the long, deep conversations about everything, but I didn't want to isolate myself any longer. A few drinks here, a dinner there. Gradually, I remembered what it was like to enjoy life again, to laugh without that cloud of misery hanging over me. It wasn't that the pain was gone, but it had started to shrink, to loosen its grip on me. One weekend, I met up with Jason, an old friend from college, someone I hadn't really spoken to much during the mess of the separation. He had been one of the few people who knew what had happened with Samantha, and unlike others, he hadn't pestered me with constant texts or pitying calls. He just let me come to him when I was ready. We sat in a crowded bar, nursing beers as the noise around us provided a comforting backdrop to our conversation. After some small talk about work and life, Jason finally asked the question I knew was coming. So, how are you holding up? With the divorce and everything? I took a sip of my drink, letting the cold beer settle in my chest before answering. Honestly, I'm doing better than I thought I would. At first, it felt like my whole world was falling apart. But now, I don't know. I feel like I can breathe again. Jason nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's a tough thing to go through, man. But you're doing the right thing. Taking care of yourself, moving forward. Yeah, I said, staring at the amber liquid in my glass. I guess I've just realized that Samantha wasn't the person I thought she was. Or maybe she changed. I don't know. But I can't keep dwelling on it. It's over. Jason leaned back in his chair, taking a long drink before responding. That's the hardest part, man. Letting go of what you thought your life was going to be. But once you do, you realize there's a whole other life waiting for you. His words hit home in a way that I hadn't expected. I had been so focused on the loss of Samantha, of the life we were supposed to have, that I hadn't stopped to think about the possibilities that lay ahead. I was free now in a way I hadn't been in years. Free to build something new, something better, something that was mine. I left the bar that night with a strange sense of peace. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and that there would be days when the weight of everything would hit me all over again. But I also knew that I had the strength to keep going. As I walked through the city streets, the air cool against my skin, I felt a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. This was my life now, messy, complicated, but mine. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to live it.